within our communities. Um, I'm a daughter of a long ago 1930s San Anto Chicano father and a mother from a South Texas Vaquero family. I'm a mommy to three children and currently a co founder and presenter with the community based Institute for Chicanx Psychology. I was an organizer for the collective Latina Mommy for more than 15 years. And my community home is the Calpuliteo Caliteo Yolo, me and my family. The preservation of our culture and community is a driving force in my life. And I'm a founding member of Academia Cuatli, where Kiawit is a program coordinator and teacher, and which is a local language and cultural revitalization school program for Spanish speaking and Mexican American elementary students. I'm also a past council member of Alma de Mujer and a danzante de la Luna and a danzante with Danza Mexica Xochipilli. My writing, my dancing, and community work is medicine toward the liberation, healing, and flourishing of my children and our people. Okay, so that is us. That is who's going to be on this panel today. So I wanted to, did either of you want to say hello really quickly? And then I wanted to jump right into why we think it's important to discuss our identity and the words we use to name ourselves. But first, did either of you want to say anything before I ask that question?
I just want to say hello to everybody, and I want to thank you, Tlasotiani, and Hermano Manuel for having us on here. Um, like I said before in other discussions, uh, Brown Continent has many branches, and the one we've been concentrating on, where the large group of Native Americans are involved, is Identify Native 2020 census, where we've been pushing our people to identify with their race, their ancestral roots from the Western Hemisphere. Um, so just want to say hi to everyone, and thanks for having us. I'm the one that usually says I'm the one that sticks my neck out. I
Yes.
mean, with all due respect to our member, our editorial team, they wish to remain anonymous for the time being, and maybe they'll do voice only. But we do have a large amount of people helping out with that effort. Thank you.
Oh, okay, that's good to know. Yeah, I've seen you many times lead these kinds of discussions, and yeah, you definitely take some hits for identifying as native, and so we're gonna get into that and figure out why these things are important. So I wanted to say that well, we know that our history is complex, it's multifaceted, and we as a people have tremendous strengths, a rich ancestral medicine, ways, knowledge, wisdom, abilities. We also have a colonized history, and I don't know if anybody maybe needs to take care of themselves and feel if they feel triggered, but I am going to talk a little bit about how complicated, just on the surface, our colonized history is. It includes rape, torture, and destruction of our sacred items, our cultural treasures burned. And through this long process, this over 500-year process, we've been separated from our cultural lineage. It's become invisible. Arbitrary lines have been drawn called borders on our native land, and we're told we don't belong here and that we're a drain on the economy. So it's very complex. It seems invisible that our people still picking the food that comes to our tables, that they're in those conditions where the fires are burning during the COVID conditions. They're in living in poverty without any resources or health care, as many of our people are. And so I think it's important to bring out what's invisible and to explore identity. Language matters. It matters what we think, what we say, the actions we take. So we're going to take some time to unpack that and look a little deeper into what we call ourselves. I know some elders are tired of this conversation that we've been having for 100 years, trying to organize, trying to come together, trying to gain social justice, trying to gain power. But it's important to keep the discussion going and see what we can come to. So the first question I want to ask, I'll start with Kiawi, Alejandro, is why do you think it's important what words we choose to call ourselves? You know, there's choices, right? Latino, Hispanic, Mexican American, Chicano, Native American, Mestizo. Why do you think it's important that we um important what we choose to call ourselves?
Um, because identity is everything. It tells us who we are, where we come from, what land we're connected to. So depending on the name or the way the identifying term you want to use as your persona or your being will tell people who you are. So we've been pushing people to say brown people from here, from the Western Hemisphere, who originate from here, to identify as Native American because that's our race. Race, of course, we've gotten. I don't know if we had a nickel for every comment where people chime in and say race is a social construct. They really don't even know what they're saying. You know, they just they're repeating like parrots. You know, race is a social construct, and like they can't back that up. They can't explain. It's just a one-liner that people use. But the fact is, it's a European created construct. The separation of the people of the earth into races, and that happened in the early 1800s with Friedrich Blumenbach, who specified. You know, he classified human beings into black, red, white, yellow, and brown. Brown being the Malaysian people, but the fact of the reality is like the majority of all those people, except with respect to the white people, is like we're brown in different shades. But nonetheless, now that millions of our people know those categories, well, they created this mess, the Europeans. Now we're going to make them see it, and we're going to use it to our advantage as a tool. And we're going to call ourselves Native Americans because basically that's who we are, and that's what billions of people around the world know. You know, so it's important. You know, and apart, we're not using this to erase or override our original, authentic ancestral names of our people. I mean, the majority of us that identify Native, uh, they know who they are, and about half of us speak our original languages. We know our songs. We practice our ceremony. The others, like, we're helping them find a way, and they're finding it on their own through heavy investigation. So, I mean, we have people like deep down in Mexico, as from Caxcan, Yoeme, and then Coahuilteca, or Yuequipilan, Inineyu from Canada, Bodwedwadmi or Anishinaabe from the Great Lakes, Okonichi from the East Coast. I mean, there's a lot of us, you know. So I mean, we're using this as a strategy, you know. Identify yourself according to the race that you are. If you are not white, not black, not Asian, that means you're Native American. And it's important because it ties us back to the land, and it's our protection. That's why we're asking our people, if you choose any other term, you're automatically going to be subject to abuse. If you call yourself Hispanic, well, our race is not Hispanic, and that's not even a race. You know, that means a European culture from Spain. Latino, same thing. European culture from ancient Rome, which is now Italy. And they still refer to themselves that way as Latinos, the real Latinos. And we've even had Italians comment on our Identify Native page where they say, stop taking our identity. You are not Latino. We are. And we took screenshots. So it's very important. It's for our protection and also to reconnect us to the land and not leave us in a point where we can easily be called trespassers, illegal, or foreign. And, you know, eventually as we gain foothold, the laws, the racist laws and the apartheid borders of these countries won't be able to gain a foothold or corral us and abuse us like we used to. Because Native Americans cannot be illegal on their continent. They cannot be subjected to cages, to detention camps, you know. But it's all a matter of awakening the vast majority of our people to the fact that they are Native American.
That even just unpacking what you just said right now, that's very powerful because right now, like we know there's been a what's it called, Manuel? The thing that the president did that says you're divisive if you use
The
diversity.
executive order. He did
Yeah,
an executive order.
yeah. So it's important, like you're saying, it to take power and to understand who we are through identity. So, Manuel, I don't know if people normally call you Dr. Samaripa or should I call you Manuel?
No, just call me Manuel, of course.
Okay. Manuel,
But
why do you think it's important the way we identify?
well, I think, actually, I know that part of the reason we're doing the panels because we share, a lot of the same experiences, the three of us. But it's important to come also with our distinct experiences. But really, I mean, my hermano said exactly what I've always said is identity is everything. What we decide to choose, and I'll start from there because, I mean, even personally, as a young college student getting into this field of psychology that I've been um, trying to decolonize and work against in so many ways because of it has the same type of European individualistic frameworks that they try to place on our people, and it's incredibly damaging. But my point was that the whole reason I got into this field was because of identity, because I could see even at that age, my friends in high school and those even younger being singled out, being treated in abusive ways because we were brown, and then our people internalizing, internalizing those negative ideas about themselves, and then that becomes self-destructive. One of the things that really irritates me is when we're talking about wellness and some of our own people, not through the fault of their own and others, they're trying to say, look, I'm trying to get away from kind of the way that our culture, um, all those negative aspects of our culture where we um, do all these unhealthy behaviors, right? And I always correct and say that's not our culture. We have engaged in behaviors because we've been abused, we've been tortured, we've been marginalized, and our people have tried to find ways. When you don't give a whole community options to better themselves, and you regulate them to neighborhoods or prisons, or and if they cross those boundaries, there's consequences. Well, you're treating people like you would treat caged animals. And so those behaviors that come from us, that may not be as healthy, so to speak, don't come from our culture. They come from us being cornered for hundreds of years and trying to find ways to survive. So that's what we have to like rework. Our culture is full of wisdom and ways of healing, and we've just we have been subjugated. And so I know there's a lot more to talk about, but the other piece is that I see a lot of our people identifying in the ways that are acceptable, or the ways that the larger society says are acceptable, so that they can feel accepted. It's a natural human response to not want to be excluded, right? But what happens is when they accept those labels, they're accepting all the false negative stereotypes, and they internalize them. So that can lead to self-doubt in the small range, but I could also lead to self-hate in the larger, in the larger realm for a lot of our people. And so I'll just stop there
Yeah.
for now. Yeah.
I want to point out too that there seems to be a tremendous amount of internal work doing that, internalized oppression, working through that back to believing that we have the right um, to call ourselves what we truly are. But again, there's a lack of information, a lack of understanding. Everybody says different things. And I notice when these conversations arise that people get mad. They're like, oh, you guys are not us, but anybody who dares to speak about even racism or identity or what we call ourselves, they feel like people are being divisive. They feel like, who cares what we call ourselves? They feel like people are if we notice in ourselves, some people notice an anger arising, like we're causing trouble. If you don't like this country, get out of here, that kind of thing. but if you think, like you're saying, if you unpack it a little bit, why does that, why is that upsetting? It's because there's an inequitable power structure, and we're trained to become that oppressive mechanism. We're a part of it, and so we believe that when we speak in these power terms about who we are, that we're causing problems. So let's just go to the basic names that people know. Again, I don't blame my brothers, sisters, siblings for not knowing, what we don't know. So let's spend a little bit of time just with the basic names, say what they are, where they came from, and so we can get a better understanding. Because some people are like, I don't know, am I Mexican American? Well, I am American, I'm Mexican. So let's just go through the terms a little bit. The first term, let me pull up my notes here, would be Hispanic. Let's see here. For those that are really trying to, just at the beginning of trying to figure out what to call ourselves, um, so what does Hispanic mean? What's the origin of the term? And what are we saying about ourselves if we use this term? Do you want me to call you Kiawit or Alejandro?
Either one is fine.
Okay, Kiawit.
You know me as Kia.
Yeah, I know. It's hard for me to say Alejandro.
Mhm.
Okay, so Kiawit, where did the term Hispanic come from? I think you touched on that a little bit. And what are we saying about ourselves if we use that term?
Okay, Hispanic comes from Hispania, which is Latin for uh, what later became called, but Hispania by the Roman Empire was the Iberian Peninsula, and that became España, which today we know is Spain. So Hispanic was borrowed from that, and then it was used as a misnomer applied to brown people or people who have Spanish origin names and surnames around the 70s and 80s. And it has its origins even further back with the Nixon administration, where they're just going to bundle all these people uh, with Spanish names and surnames and calling them Hispanic. So, I mean, basically, they're saying that we have this Hispanic flavor or Hispanic. It's like calling people from China Oriental and anybody who's from Asia Orient. We're just going to loop them all in.
Oh,
That's
that's a
their
good way.
creation.
Mm.
That's their creation. When the majority of us who are Hispanic are not from Spain, and we do not have, Spanish blood. And if we do, seeing that it's Hispanic Heritage Month, a lot of our people are out there proudly saying that they're Hispanic because they don't know who they are. They've been raised, like Manuel said, we've been raised in a cage. We've been raised in a jail cell, basically, and fed all this propaganda. You know, it takes time, but it settles in, and with enough repetition, we're repeating it now, and not even knowing why. But yes, because we want to fit in, we don't want to rock the boat. You know, we're nice and comfy here in the United States of America. Let's not upset the status quo, and let's just play along. So yeah, a lot of people are going to call themselves Hispanic. And then also the notion of mixed blood came up too. Well, we do share blood. It doesn't matter how much you share or not, mixed blood or not, we're still Native American, unless clearly it's obvious that you are European. The Jewish mothers the Jewish women during World War II who were raped by Nazi soldiers, you don't hear any of their offspring bragging that they're half German or part Nazi or whatever. They're proudly saying that they're Jewish. Same thing with African Americans. They have a lot of them have various levels of white blood through the rape and admixture. You don't hear them saying that they're mixed anything. They're proudly saying that they're black and proud. So why are we jumping and saying we're Hispanic or anything but Native American?
So that was going to be my follow-up question, because I've had people say, no, 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 you can't deny your Spanish blood. It's in there. Just accept that you're the colonizer too. You can't get away from that. How do we, reconcile that within ourselves? And it sounds like for some reason people are really determined to for us to say, yeah, to recognize the Spanish blood and to recognize any conqueror blood, and to prove our that we are native to this continent, to prove people are, nobody, like you said, nobody asked Chinese people like, well, what's your blood quantum, how Chinese are you, or like you said, African Americans, well, what is your DNA ancestry thing say. But for us, it's like we're really, people want us to paste it on our foreheads and know exactly what percentages we are.
Mm.
Why do you think there's such a backlash and such a pushback for us claiming our indigenous, our native roots? Manuel, you want to answer that, and then
Mm.
Kiawit, I would like to get both of your perspectives on that.
Yeah, no. I think the metaphors that my hermano brought forth, are like very clear. The other one that I think of when I get that question is like, if you were in a house as a baby, you were a baby, and some people came, they invaded your house, they slaughtered your family, they burned down your house, and they took you away with them, and they decided to raise you, um, and they raised you in their image. And later on, you grow up and you realize that you were part of this other family this whole time. That is and if you want to claim, because you were stolen by no choice of your own, right? And your family was slaughtered by no choice of your own. And the fact that we have been disconnected through the conquest, like our ancestors were slaughtered, the knowledge, our connection to our native family, the knowledge, a lot of it is destroyed. And if we wake up and realize that we are native, that family that raised you can say, well, wait a minute, but you have no connection to that. You don't know anything about it. We raised you. Yeah, but you kept this from me, and you came and you stole and you killed my family. If I want to say that I am rightfully from that family, I can do that, and it's the truth. So we're in this odd position, and that's what conquerors do. That's what oppressors do. They disconnect you from your roots, from your knowledge, so that they can lay claim to you. And it sounds like the truth. It's true. We have been disconnected in so many ways. But just because we've been disconnected does not mean we're not native. Does not mean. And so it's up to me to what degree I want to. I don't have to. I don't have to accept the Spanish. I know that it's there, but it's up to me to decide what I want to do with that legacy. And the truth is that my legacy, as a brown person in this continent, was stolen because of that conquest. So, so I think that is my response. When people ask me, like, personally, how does that make sense to you? Aren't you denying this or that? I'm like, no, it was not my choice to be disconnected from my authentic self. I'll stop there.
Yeah, it's like we have a lot of harsh criticisms for claiming who we are, and other groups don't. So I think it's that I do want to unpack a little bit politically, maybe. I don't know why, but yeah, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, excellent analogy, Manuel. I love that because, and I want to add to his analogy too. Those who weren't kidnapped, who were kicked out on the street, they're laying there unconscious. And this is what happened with the invasion. You're sitting on the curb and you're watching somebody driving your car up and down the street. You turn around. If they didn't burn your home down, they're occupying it, which they are. They're illegally occupying our continent. You're looking around. You're like, hey, that house looks familiar. Your memory is going to come back because we were knocked out unconscious on a large scale. And what's happening now is that now that we're regaining consciousness, we're beginning to remember and we're asking questions. Our inboxes are inundated with people. Can you tell me who I am? I don't know where I come from. I know I'm not white, and they know they're not black or Asian, but they want to know. And people are starting to peel back the layers that were imposed on them. So I guess the reason why there's so much work. I mean, there's so many forces against us, against each one of us to reclaim our native identity. Because like what Manuel was saying, when you realize who you really are, your race hasn't been changed. Your DNA is still the same. It's intact, you know, but if they can convince you, who they just took your home, kicked you out on the street, to say that you are not who you think you are, they can still keep holding on to your home, your car, your family is still subjugated. They can still abuse you because you don't know that you're Native American and that they just pulled the rug out from under you and took everything that your family had. That's the last thing they want, is for all of us to have a mass awakening, realize that we're Native American, and like, hey, wait a minute, because once you realize that, there's a process that comes into play in your mind and in your heart and your spirit that cannot be reversed. Because you're like, hey, wait a minute, that means I'm Native American. That means I'm from here. I'm not from anywhere else. That means that, wait, these people here, these white people, they crossed the ocean and they invaded. This is my land. You know what? They stole our land. Now I want it back. That's the last thing they want, is to have millions of brown people reclaiming their original ancestral identity, fighting for their land back. That's at the base of everything. And to also maintain brown people, subjugated, where they can continue to abuse them and intentionally confuse them. Because that way we'll never even think of coming around to fighting for our land back and taking the resources and the land that they've been bleeding dry for 526, almost 27 years. So they need us in that position of ignorance, stupidity, confused, drunk on convenience with all the benefits and like the things that they've been throwing, that this American society produces. And like even the entertainment industry, how many billions of dollars do they spend to keep the majority of people, even not just us, basically asleep and dumbed down. So that's been happening to us since day one of 1492. And that's where the word indios comes from. Indios comes from sin Dios. That was the first thing they called us. Without God, godless heathens. Therefore, we can subjugate them and force them to accept Christianity, speak our language, and we're going to civilize them. We're going to try to make them into us, brown versions of us. Pero no tienen razón. They're stupid. So we got to guide them with whips and chains and murder and cages, and it's still happening.
Yeah. And it was for our own good. That's the
Yes.
original thought,
Mm-hmm.
And if I can add to that, I wanted to say two things. One, really quickly, because I know there's a wealth of information and resources, and I know my hermano's really deep into a lot of the information and source material. But just this discussion reminds me of that 1960s book, The Open Veins of Latin America.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a graphic novel. It's pretty dense, but I think it doesn't shy away from the brutality of the conquest. And I think that's just one thing I'll throw out there. Another thing is with our native brothers and sisters here in the United States and North America, I think sometimes, and I know Lasatiani, we're going to touch on this. I just wanted to say really quickly, again, it's a false distinction when we see the differences between our northern brothers and sisters and us from the southern part of the hemisphere, in the sense that we see our northern brothers and sisters as they know what tribe they came from, right? There's been a lot of atrocities, but we're not going to talk about what we know, but we know the tribe we came from. And then Gowie was talking about, we get a lot of people say, well, where am I from? And we do know that in the southern parts, there are some of our people that have retained their sovereignty and who they are, but not the vast majority of us, right? And the difference is when the invaders came from England to what became the United States, they came as colonies to settle. They came as families. They didn't want to integrate or even touch or talk with the native people, so they pushed them out, right? What happened with us is it was a military invasion. It was a military conquest. They came to take over the land. So they came mostly males, mostly soldiers. And so what did they do? They basically raped the continent. And so that became now what became Latinos and Latin Americans. And when we talk about the mixing of the races, right? It was a violent mix. And there's nothing like, as you were saying with Gyawi, with the Germans, the Nazi Germans, and the Jewish people, and this happened in Eastern Europe too, Bosnia and the Serbs and all that, where they went and raped so that people would be ashamed of their ancestry once their children were born. Um, so that disconnects us. It was a very physical disconnection from our people and who we were, and and that's why there's some of that difference. The invasions were different types of invasions. So just wanted to say
That is really important because I know, I mean, we really need to talk about all the words like tribe and blood quantum and figure out where that came from. But we know even our brothers, our sisters, our siblings in from the northern tribes or northern peoples. I mean, also don't some also don't want to accept who we are at times as native people to this continent, because yeah, we don't have our tribes formed in that way. So it was important to talk about why that's different, but it doesn't make us less native to this continent and to who we are and connected to our ancestors, which is in our DNA. It's in our genetic memory, it's in our spirits. Um, and I just want to pause for a second because right off the bat, all three of us have spent a lot of time studying and researching and understanding identity from different perspectives, internally, psychologically, and power differences, institutionalized separation from who we are as a people. So those people who are logging in to try and just, figure out, what do I call myself? Mexican American, Hispanic, Latino, what do I call myself? This is a lot for them to hear. We're using flat out strong facts about how our history was, and it's an intense conversation. So we might be like 50 steps ahead of somebody who might have just been wondering, well, I don't know what word to use, um and and I just want to acknowledge that we're all at different places, and that there's no blame on our people for not knowing what to use. It's been very confusing. In the 1960s, people started using certain terms to try and organize to gain power. And right now, still today, there seems to be an erasure of our lived experience. We seem to be invisible, having, there's our people are literally in detention centers, but that doesn't really get talked about as much. Or and the kids, they're having complex trauma that is not going to heal for many generations, and that's still happening to our people for the past 500 plus years. This is no small thing, but for some reason, the conversation in this country barely wants to be a black and white conversation discussing the trauma that our African American brothers and sisters and siblings have gone through. But we just don't even seem to make the conversation at all. So just, take a minute, absorb what you're hearing. This is not made up information. They're facts. I know it's intense, and it's but that is really what's happened and what's been happening and what's currently happening. And it can be shocking to bring the invisible and make it visible. But all of this, research it, it's there. So just to go back to the basic words, Mexican American, Latino, Hispanic, mestizo, uh Native American. What do those mean? Or where did they come from? Why are they accurate or inaccurate? We talked about Hispanic, and I think we've talked about Latino too. That we're not either of those things. But again, what are we supposed to call ourselves? Everybody calls us Latino. I mean, everybody calls us Hispanic. It's a pride for some of us to at least have this month to celebrate who we are. But again, we revisit the fact that language is important, and it's important what we call ourselves. So, what do we think of the term Chicano or Mexican American? Does anybody have? I know the word Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx is very dear to me from our current struggle since the 60s. But what do we think about that term? Kiawi?
Um, I used to call myself Chicano. But again, that's not our race. Our race is Native American. And I had been working on in the early 2000s. I was working on a oral history project, interviewing our people, so-called Mexican Americans and Mexican or Chicanos, just so people can know the people I was interviewing specifically that were growing up in the 30s and 40s. And one guy from Southern California, out in the Indio and Cochea, out in the Imperial Valley, he said we were rural Pachucos, and he said our people, he said it was our culture that invented the word Chicano. According to him, this is his experience, this is his story, oral history. And he said we kept that to ourselves because of the border created it separated our people. So we called ourselves Chicanos to say that we were from down south, but growing up in a new country. He said, and because to the people from Mexico, we were not Mexican anymore, and there's no way we could ever be white because we're still being called spicks and beaners and wetbacks by the field bosses or the growers, where they picked out in those fields. So he said it was good to see it come back again in the 60s, where people use it as a term for empowerment and political, liberation or political equality, or, whatever, what people would want to refer to it. But when you call yourself Chicano, again, you're limiting and you're cutting off who you are, because you're subjecting yourself to one specific region. Because what's in millions of people's minds, a Chicano is ex-Mexican or Mexican American growing up in the Southwest U.S. Okay, when you say you're Mexicano, well, you're pledging allegiance and you're saying you belong to a nation that was created by the criollos, or the descendants of the original Spaniards, who took the land from their mom and dad, king and queen, went to war over it, and then called it Mexico. But many people get confused because it's an indigenous name, Mexico. And so when you call yourself any of those, or U.S. citizen or American, you're relegating yourself to one specific region rather than saying, I'm Native American. The Western Hemisphere is my home. This is my land. And we were here before borders were created. And Chicano is a response to that, being of Mexican descent, born in the United States, and then looking for, fighting on the political realm for some form of equality or some sort of to raise our standards of living. I interviewed some people from the Chicano movement in the 60s, and that's what they were fighting for. It's like, man, we lived where there were dirt roads, no running water, no sewer. We still had outhouses. And they saw what, the white people had, and they said, you know what, we don't want to live like this anymore. So that's what they fought for. And also, they opened the doors to the universities, made it more accessible to brown people, but at the heart of it all, Native American, it's our race. And it's also,
Yeah.
we don't open ourselves up to any debate as to who we are and where we're from. Because as
Right.
a Chicano, on the large scale of things and the larger panorama of this is my homeland, no, but you're Chicano, that means you're a ex-foreigner born here, and now it's like you can't be one of us, and you never will. So it's like we got to use strategy. That's all it is strategy.
Yeah, if I can, yeah, that's really good. You're bringing up 2 points that I'm connecting with, Hermano. One is that the argument a lot of the times for the pan-ethnic labels like Hispanic or Latino, as opposed to Chicano or Mexican American, is one of the arguments against that is like, well, but that leaves all of us out. Like, how do we come up with a name that, yes, we have, our families are from Mexico or Mexico, right? What about the Cubanos, those of us that share, some cultural lineages? What about those of us from Latin America? What about Puertorriqueños, Boricuas? We need something that identifies all of us, right? That's the argument. And what you're speaking to is kind of not really flipping the script, but making it more clear. It's like, well, the label is Native American. I mean, that is a unifying label for all of us, and it's more accurate in terms of race, in terms of strategy. It is who we are, and it goes across all of those constructed countries that came after the conquest, all those city-state, you know, structures. And so that answers the unifying question, you know, from what you're saying. The other thing that you're reminding me of is that people always say, well, and I think Lastiani, we were talking about this before, and I think it was going to come up if we had time, is one of the things, why not just American, right? Like, why not just, we're just American, or why don't you call yourselves just American? Well, that is a national identity. That's an identity of nationality. And you were alluding to this, Hermano, when we were talking about claiming Mexico. Those are identities of nationality. They are not identities of race. They're not identities of ethnicity. And so I think when we use those words, as you were saying, Tlasotiani, language matters, sometimes words get interchanged and people forget that they mean different things. So like Mexican American was used as an ethnic label, but it has the word American in there. American is not an ethnicity, it's a national identity. So you're mixing concepts. And so of course it's confusing. If you want to talk about aren't we Americans, well, I mean, if you want to look at my birth certificate, you know, according to the rules the rules of this government, I am already nationally, you know, my citizenship is American. That's not even a question. I'm not talking about that. You know, we're talking about something else. We're talking about things that impact the way we're treated in society based on our race and based on our lineage. So those things just kind of came up as you were talking. So I wanted to just.
I have a
Can I?
question.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead, and then I'll
Yeah.
have a follow-up question.
Yeah, exactly what Manuel was saying. Right now, there's a lot of clamoring and propaganda being fed at so-called Latinos, because the majority of them are Native American, but they're trying to use that as a unifying factor. In other words, a unifying factor under their colonial designation. Because again, Latino means Italian, ancient Rome, people who speak the Latin language. And that has nothing to do with us. You know, it has nothing to do with brown original people from the Western Hemisphere. So yeah.
How did we end up with that term then? How did we end up as being called Latinos?
Well, can I?
And, go ahead.
And then, yeah, of course we can. The quick reason that I have seen is that, because it's funny, because it's under this illusion of inclusion, and that when we got it, we were named Hispanic. All the Brazilians were like, well, wait a minute, you know, basically Spain didn't conquer us, Portugal conquered us, and we speak Portuguese. So then people went back to the drawing board and said, well, Portuguese and Spanish all come from, they're all Romance languages. They have their root in Latin, the language of Latin. So let's go back to exactly what Hermano said, you know, Rome, the Italian, you know, the Latin languages. That's a unifying base. So instead of saying Hispanic, let's include the Brazilians, and then we'll call them Latin America. So it really spreads the blanket so thin that it becomes really inaccurate. And that's what go ahead, Hermano. I'm sorry about that.
No, it's all right. The word Latin came from, or it's used here, imposed on us, came from the early 1800s when a French, I think he was like not a philosopher, but he created the term Latin America, Michel Chevalier. And he did this with the help of the French, who were in control of France and had their foothold here on this side of on our continent.
That's right. The French too. That's right.
They're the ones who created the term Latin America, and now everybody subject to that, you know, jurisdiction that they just created all of a sudden by their will are Latin Americans. And they did this in opposition to, you know, to gain a foothold on this continent and overpower or like kind of like erase Portuguese and Spanish and Anglo ties. So I said, you know what, as French, we're going to tie into something bigger, Latin. So that's where the term Latin America came from. That's where the word Latin Americans comes from. That's where Hispanicized, we call ourselves Latinos and Latinas from. So, I mean, if people out there listening, you call yourself Latino or Latina, I mean, you need to get it through your heads and really think on this, that it has nothing to do with us as brown original people from the Western Hemisphere. That has its history in the early 1800s, and because of repetition and repetition, they've been using it against us now to erase our existence, so that we no longer reclaim who we are, and then we go to reclaiming our homeland. That's how the Europeans stay in control. I mean, that's the
So
history of Latin.
So we're hearing, see, now we're really getting some information about where the word Latinos came from, where did the word Hispanic come from, all of these things that we just, take for granted or maybe just don't know what else to call ourselves. So I guess then we would have to, the mechanism would be for each of us, one, to educate ourselves, right, which is what we're taking the time to do right now. And two, to start calling ourselves something else. Now I'm hearing a lot. We're talking a lot about being Native American because we are native to this continent. That's who we are. I have a question, which is how do we reconcile the unique cultural experience of who we are? Native American. Okay, that could be a lot of different peoples, from the north or from the southern
Hmm.
peoples. So how do we say, you know what, I'm really proud of being Mexican. I'm proud of my roots. I'm proud of this unique cultural experience of who I am. So how would we, Native American sounds like it erases that part of who we are. Do you recommend using two different terms, one when we're speaking about us culturally and one when we're speaking about race and using strategy to move forward politically? Or how would we acknowledge who we are culturally? I don't know who wants
I,
to take
I,
that one.
I personally say I'm Native American from the Yuecuespila, the Deer people of South Texas, because that I do have ties to that from my paternal side. My mother's side comes from Central Mexico. We really can't say what nation our people pertain to. I'm not going to run and say the catch-all that a lot of people use, Mexica or Aztec, but I do know that they come from Puebla and Estado de Mexico, and the rest, and others come from Chihuahua. So I just say Anahuacat, from Anahuac, or I'm Native American Anahuacat, from the South,
And
and
the
we're not.
Anahuaca means the South, as in Mexico, or specific
Mm-hmm.
peoples?
Yeah, a lot of people have a lot of people interpret Anahuac in various ways. It's really popular right now is the northern part of the Western Hemisphere, but Anahuac, could be even the island that the Mexica built in Lake Texcoco, which means surrounded by water. On a greater scale, well, that part of the continent has water and ocean on each side. You know, People are going to interpret it how they deem fit, and that's fine. But it's not to erase who we are linguistically and also nation-wise originally. So we encourage people to do the investigation, find out where your ancestors come from. And once you investigate, you say, I'm Native American from such and such nation.
Okay.
We're not. It's going to take a while, because I mean, if it took 500 something years to get millions of people where we're at now, it's going to take some time to get them all back and I don't know, all back on board, but a lot.
I think
Well,
what you're talking about, oh, is it okay?
let me
Uh,
just add one little piece to that, and then yeah, I definitely want to hear what your answer to that would be too. But also, though, a lot of us have been through colonization separated from our specific peoples, who we are, and our elders wouldn't speak of it because there was a shame, recognizing the brownness of who we are, and they were taught to, just say that we're, choose the Spanish side and value light skin and all of that. So, I mean, it's really complex. But those of us who say don't have any clue about how we would connect with who our people were. And of course, we're trying to survive, busy, on the bus, in the laundromats, trying to raise the kids and all of that, and aren't going to do that. Um, how do we reconcile still uh, our cultural unique experience of being Mexican from that land and Native American? I'm looking for the terms that we could use. Go ahead, Manuel.
And what I think was coming up when I was hearing my hermano speak is, I mean, really, the position is it's a matter of principle. It's a matter of principle because it's not going to answer in terms of the way my hermano identifies, is not going to answer the broader question, I think, that Lasatiani, that you're asking, which is how can we as a community come together and choose a broader label? Because that goes to the heart of how our Western, more modern society in general labels people toward political power, toward identity. And what I think we're saying here, and I think what I think Gawi is saying, is that to be more authentic, it's not going to be easy to fit that into a broader palette. It's just not. It's going to be a matter of principle. We're going to have to try to identify how we are specifically, and that would take time. It's I think the answer you're looking for is to a question that was constructed by a colonizing force. They constructed that type of
Mm,
question so that we could fit into that type of box, so that we could then kind of, and that's the way our society is set up. You look for a Facebook group, you look for something, you look for a unifying name that shows you're part of a community. There's nothing wrong with that. All I'm saying is the whole structure is set up to guide us to more broader pan-ethnic labels. Or if we choose something that's opposite from that, then we're an outlier, like Chicana or something. And so I think,
true.
I think there's also the shrewder. We can't ignore some of the responses that we get when we're talking about like Latino and Hispanic, because I've heard people say in a factual way, they're just not interested in justice. It's a shrewder perspective. It's like, hey, if you're the colonizer, you win, you make the rules. The people that won, the conquerors, the ones that are in charge, they make the rules. That's what the way it always happens. So of course they're going to push broader pan-ethnic labels. I mean, to the winner take the spoils, or whatever that idea is. Now, I don't buy into that, of course, because that means you're not invested in people and in justice and what's going to happen. But that's where some people come from, that argument, and that's a very clear argument on their perspective. It's like I've heard people say, why do our Native American brothers and sisters have reservations? Why are they allowed the fantasy of sovereignty? Why are we treating that group different than the Mexicans, the African Americans, any other group that comes that's not white in the United States? Because we won, basically. I've heard people say, like, we won, and so this whole like reservations and that's why are they getting that special treatment? Like, and I've heard people say that from a perspective that they're not, where they're honestly saying like this might be messed up, but what's the difference, right? And of course, the difference is that this country sometimes tries to pretend it has a conscience sometimes, and so it did this middle ground, because the genocide of our northern Native brothers and sisters was so in our face in some ways, just because of the way it was set up. That's a whole other discussion, that it was harder for them to get away with that. So they try to find some middle compromise that really doesn't escape the fact that even our northern Native brothers and sisters are trapped into structures that are not of their own making.
So, I'm sorry, did I cut you off?
No, and I know we're not answering your question.
Well, I just want to say that I want to be respectful of people's time. I know it's 1:02, but this conversation is far from over. And whoever needs to go, of course, go. But are y'all okay with maybe going to 1:30? Or
I'm all
did you,
right.
Yeah.
you're
And I
okay?
was and I was going to see if it would be possible to put a question on the docket, so to speak.
Okay, well, there's so much conversation and question and debate about this that we were going to not do that to get through. But you know what? You spoke, and that's something that has entered the conversation, absolutely. So please do.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Um, Yeah, so I've been doing some different research into my ancestry, and yeah, I think one of the things that I've been confronted with um, is I guess like kind of seeing some proof, which folks are. I feel like DNA tests are really controversial for a lot of different reasons, but for all intents and purposes, it did help me find out and kind of confirm that that I have indigenous ancestry from what is now recognized as El Salvador and also the Yucatan Peninsula. Um, and so I guess like one of the things I've been grappling with um, is thinking about these different communities that I guess ancestrally speaking I'm tied to, but that I am so like far removed from in a way. Um, yeah, because to my knowledge, I guess here in the US, specifically Austin, I mean, I do know some Mayan folks, but like finding Pipil Nahuatl people is like is hard to do here in the US. And so I guess part of the identity issues thinking about you know, like would these different folks accept me, you know, and is it really my place to um I guess like try to seek that connection. So ooh, lots of identity issues, and I'm so glad that we're
Yeah.
having a conversation about this.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack. I'm going to say a few things that I want to make sure we get to, and then we'll answer that question. I want to make sure we also get to Latinidad. I've heard some discussion. I saw an African American blogger do a post saying, like, you know what, Latinidad is canceled because there's the white Latinos who have, you know, subjugated our brown, indigenous, Native American brothers and sisters, you know, and have caused harm, caused damage, you know, like in some countries where they think they don't have racism, like Venezuela, Colombia, but what they do, they just call it class issues. But you'll see that the class issues is brown people and white Latinos. I want to discuss that. Identity politics versus identity representation, what that is, what the differences are, and then ultimately ask every, you know, the panelists, what terms would you use yourself? I know Kiawit has spoken to that. I'm kind of on thinking about maybe using 3 terms depending on what circumstance I'm in. Um, and then another question would be, what do people providing services for? Right now, we say Latinos, and Manuel and I even use that word to provide services because we want to make sure we reach everybody from this continent that is in this country. So, what term we would use when we're providing services? That's another thing. But back to what Yuvia said, um, that searching, that's what we've been discussing. That searching, that reconnecting. And I think, yeah, we talked about this when we talked on the phone a few weeks ago about, yeah, you saying different people, maybe they have had a completely white privileged experience, and then, you know, they find out in their DNA that they are have native blood. And so how to reconcile that, you know, what to do with that, because, you know, their whole lived experience possibly, and this isn't maybe not what you're saying, Yuvia, I don't know about your lived experience, but that has come up, you know, do I have the right to connect? How do I connect? So that is very complicated. Giawi, do you want to speak to that? And then Manuel?
Yes. Um, we have quite a few people asking those questions, you know, and then the issue of the illusion of, like Manuel put it really well, tribal sovereignty. I mean, if you're living in a concentration camp, a reservation, and even they call it that, many of them, and that's who I learned it from, Northern natives, you know, they don't really have tribal sovereignty, you know, but they say that us reclaiming our identity and wanting to reconnect is infringing on this so-called tribal sovereignty, that we're erasing so-called indigenous voices. And but the fact remains, our race is Native American. And like Manuel said, I mean, when you begin to remember who you are, you're like, wait, I was raised the wrong way. I want to go back to my family. There's many ways to do that. And we do encourage people, if you really want to, you know, there's a very respectful way to do that. And I would start by interviewing your own family towards in the direction of those ancestral roots. Talk to your aunts and uncles. If your grandparents are still alive, ask questions, you know. And we also send out links for people to help find, you know, with maps and stuff. Right now we have Mexico kind of covered, but familysearch.org revealed specific locations if old baptismal birth and death certificates were scanned. You know, you can find, if you know the town or the pueblo where your family comes from, there are, and the church, you know, back before there were birth certificates, you know, there's ways to do this, you know, where you find out. And even people make journeys. We don't hear much about that, but I had been going into Mexico since 2008. You know, I haven't found direct family members, but there are communities who will accept you, but there's a way to go in. You know, there's a lot of people who automatically assume that whole white privilege thing, and you can't just barge into any community and, hey, guess what, guys, this is who I am. And they're like, look, they're gonna look at you like, who the heck is this person? Get out of here. You know, there are ways to connect. There's, you know, with our ancestral communities and others, you know. So I mean, we shouldn't limit ourselves. And that's the thing. That's the mind control, the indoctrination that we've been programmed and rewired with self-defeating behavior, to never want to go back there again. Never want to look, never search. Don't peel back the layers. You're okay where you're at, just accept it. There's no way out of this, but there is. But 520 something years of this same like indoctrination, this garbage has been pumped into our heads. We carry it now in our body. So yeah, it's like a fail-safe mechanism. We're on autopilot now to not want to do that and reconnect. Like, this is one of the greatest obstacles that we've been hit with, you know,
I agree.
where these beings came and turned everything upside down and backwards, to where it would be near impossible, or make us think that it would be near impossible to come back home and reconnect and remember who we are. This is like a test of all tests at this moment in time, you know.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it reminds me of the most, I think, insidious piece of oppression when it's done right is that the people that put it in place, they lay the foundation for that oppression. And then when they do it right, like I say, which is, you know, not at all, it was just terrible, is that they've built the machine and they sit back and then we do it to ourselves. Like, they set up the structure, they lay the oppression, they lay the structures out there, they do the initial conquest and colonization, and then they set it up to where just down the production line over generations, we just do it to ourselves, and they just sit back and enjoy the structure. That's the most insidious part of that type of conquest and oppression.
We're powering their system for them. And you know, lately, this past month, especially it being so-called Hispanic Heritage Month, you know, we're celebrating European domination without knowing it. We're celebrating the subjugation, the theft, rape, and murder of our people in homeland without even knowing it, by the real Hispanics, the Spaniards. You know, and we've gotten so much flack from people. How dare you? We're all Hispanic. Our blood is mixed. We carry both cultures in our veins. And that's what we're talking about. What you were saying, Manuel, we're on autopilot. We're doing it for them. We're lambasting. We're beating each other up. How dare you even think you're Native American, you mixed blood mutt? Some guy was on there calling us bastards. Everybody, no, you mixed blood bastard. You're a bastard like me. It's like they're watching this on social media. We're another demographic to be studied. Look at these
That's
wannabe
even
Indians.
that's even a foreign construct. The construct of being a bastard it's not just a true thing. It's a construct from a particular worldview doesn't come from us.
But we're exactly. But we're using it. We're doing the work. The colonizers' work for each other. They got
Yeah.
us to where we're gonna fight each other over this.
Yeah, I can't even count how many uh, native brothers and sisters that come from the same lineage that we do, have said, they just take these false ideas like, well, I back the blue, oh brother, y'all are talking about race again, and it's our own people saying these things like, just be proud to be American. But that really needs to be unpacked, because you can be anywhere on the spectrum of how proud you are to be in this country. It doesn't matter what you are. But at the same time, the social constructs and all of the institutionalized constructs that have been used against us to keep resources away from us, to keep us confused and thinking negatively about our own identity, you can recognize those too. That does it's just the anger. I'm glad you guys are talking about how angry people get when we try to identify as who we are, because that seems to be a real internal struggle for some people, that we're being, anti whatever, when we try and stand up and create wellness for ourselves, for our families. I always say, if you're a person of color, and you're to raise a healthy family is a revolutionary act. And to be well is an act of resistance. And this conversation about having the right to call ourselves what we are, the fact that it's so complicated, and that we have to go through so many steps in our mind to accept it, just tells us how much work there is to do around it. um, I wanted to follow with another question, which is, I'm sorry, did I cut you off, Manuel? Were you still talking, or did I?
No, no, just a quick reminder to everybody now that you cued in that we are going over. People that need to jump off, of course you can. We've decided to go to 1:30, so that's all.
Yeah, right. Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, Latinidad, what is the position here of white Latinos that have been, subjugating our brothers and sisters? What do we do with that? Well, I think you guys kind of answered it when you said that Latino is a construct. It isn't even a real thing. But what do people do? I know in our own Kalpuli, people really struggle. They were like, I don't know, am I white? I don't know. I don't know where I lie here. But what is the responsibility? Um, what is the perspective that you guys have on white Latinos?
Well, they're European. I mean, all right, basically we have to draw the line somewhere, right? And there are anomalies, because we do see white people being accepted, into northern communities. I mean, who by blood or some connection, they are part of that tribe or that nation, or community. But we have to draw the line somewhere. I mean, if those people are being accepted as Native American, for instance, in Virginia, uh, there's various tribes over there that were just accepted, or they were given federal recognition by Donald Trump. And you look at them, you're like, it's not hard for them to get federal recognition. If it's easy for them, then surely our Southern brothers and sisters, you know, would have no problem just saying that they're Native American when just being met with so much opposition. So we see the real Latinos, or the real Europeans, are the descendants of the criollos, or the offspring or the descendants of the original Spaniard men and women, Portuguese or whatever, whoever landed here and invaded. Okay, so the question remains, who is benefiting from this? Are we benefiting from calling ourselves Latino or Hispanic or Mestizo? No, we're not. Look at the position we've been in, and look at them. I'm going to share a story with you with this one elder from South Texas who told me, and I repeat the story because it's very interesting. He had information that this white anthropologist sought for his thesis, or for his PhD or whatever it was. And this elder had information and context that would be really helpful to this guy. So he told me, he's like, I'm going to test this dude out. And he asked the white guy, he's like, okay, I got a question for you. He's like, what do white people tell their children to be successful? And he thought, and he said, Nothing. We just hand it over to them. You know, in other words, he's admitting we have the land, the resource, we got everything. You all have nothing. So, I mean, these white Latinos, if you look at them, the majority of them don't live like many of us do. You can go to Mexico and you can see it's like night and day for most of them, you know? So they're still benefiting from it. You know, we never have. We're not, of course, because it was like Manuel said, it was set up for a certain people for a certain reason. Because if they came here to subjugate the people in order to get the land and the resources, they got to keep us in that position or they lose it, you know? And our growing numbers are a threat. So Latinidad and the promoters of Latinidad, you know, like Univision and Telemundo, I mean, they're just trying to include everybody. If we can include all these brown people and keep telling them they're Latino, I mean, we got them. And we got a sellable demographic, people that will buy all the crap that we're trying to sell to them and market to them. So that's another part of the whole Latino unity factor in play, is like, let's make a marketable commodity, you know, or a demographic that we can market to, and they'll buy it up, saying that this is Latino, that's Latino, you know, when in reality, the real Latinos are running that show and the real Hispanics are running that show behind the curtains. You know?
That's important, along the lines of which we unify ourselves, right? I mean, like what we're trying to do to gain power and resources, that's a different kind of trying to unify, as opposed to Latinidad, which is still the people in power being in power, and it'd be racially constructed, not for our benefit. Okay, Manuel, did you have anything to add to Latinidad?
No, I think if there's something else to move to, we can. I mean, yeah, I do, but I think I think I'll just say one thing, which is for me, when I hear that, it reminds me of another discussion like that we could have, which is really kind of breaking down who are white Latinos, because to me, or that's a whole different, can be a bigger whole distinction and discussion. But to sum it to one point is that if we're talking about maybe overwhelming direct lineage that's more European, or lighter skin, like whiter skin, which we know may or may not, you know, sometimes DNA does funny things, genetics does funny things, right? And so that may or may not be related to that overwhelming, you know, heritage. But the vast majority, even of the light-skinned Latinos in Latin America, have some type of indigenous blood. It's been 500 years. So one piece of that conversation is that a denial on their part? And if it is, and they just happen, you know, to be lighter skinned more often. And if it is, then some of the things that we're saying to just straight out white European Americans here, which is that's white privilege, do your own work. I mean, if you're privileging from your skin tone, you got to do your own work. You got to acknowledge that privilege. And if you do have some native blood in there, which is true, but you walk around with a lighter skin face and you've gotten benefits from that, you know, white Latinos, then it's your call on how much work you're going to do to own that privilege. Because then people, well, it's not my fault. Well, that people treat me that way. Well, maybe not, but you are getting privilege from that. So you know, it has to do with kind of checking, doing that work. It's a lot more complicated than all that, but those are a couple of things that I thought about.
Yeah, Manuel, I think you've talked about cultural identity from a psychological perspective before. And one of the things was how much you do for your people, you know? So if you are in white circles benefiting from white privilege and you have native blood, you know, how much of a responsibility and how much do you make a part of your life to work for the people who are marginalized, are subjugated? And how much is it a part of your life? You know, if you're just you know, connecting in ways that is superficial, just so that you have a, you know, you can say, hey, no, I'm Mexican, I'm Native American, then you really need to do your own internal work to recognize your privilege.
Yeah, and I know that.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I know that Gabby wants to say something really quickly. I mean, I know you want to say something, Amano. we have to do work on the other side too, because as you were talking, if you've been benefiting from this skin privilege and you're Latino and you find that you're Native, you also have to do the other work. You can't just say, hey, I'm Native, and go join those circles right away, like Yaoi was saying, and just be open because you've had this whole life of this privilege. So you would also have to be humble and aware of that piece as well.
Right.
You know, like, oh, I'm going to do my work. I do have Native blood. I'm not white. Yeah, but you know, you have to do the work on the other side. So
Respectful, right.
yeah, respectful.
Kiawi, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, yes, I agree. You know, and one of the main editors of the page wrote an article. You can find it there at Brown Continent, I think. And you go to the articles or notes section, where he says, you know, we have to draw the line. You know, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, then it must be a duck. You know, what we see before our eyes, yes, there are going to be some anomalies, you know, where genetics plays tricks or is a mystery still. You know, now it is. I mean, because we really don't know what our ancestors knew about that. But yes, a lot of white passing natives out there, well, they're using the white privilege, they benefit from it, and then they want immediate acceptance into the community. And I'm telling our people, you know, just identify your race, and if you want to investigate, you know, and reconnect with your ancestral roots, by all means, everybody do your research, do the work, and not sit content with, well, I'm Native American. I mean, no, empower yourself by knowing why you're saying that you are Native American when you do find out that you are in fact Native American, you know? And so you can stand your ground. If not, you're just gonna be swept off in this tirade, you know? I mean, this is going to be a topic of great debate. And that's why we asked our people to identify who are Native American racially, you know, to identify as Native on the census, because we're going to show proof that this is going to be, you know, we're blowing the lid on something that they've tried to keep hidden. Like, where are all these millions of natives coming out from? Look, I mean, these numbers are skyrocketing every 10 years exponentially. And we're going to make it a topic of national debate, you know, because we are going to receive a lot of flack for that. Everybody is like, no, that's not true. Those are false numbers. They're going to deny, they're going to fight, you know, but we want to take this to a world level, you know, to where we can show the world and bring global pressure to tie the hands of the invader and say, guys, you cannot do this anymore. Because they're trying, when we're branded as criminals, when we're all separated and confined to all these separate like identity tags or ethnicities that don't even apply to us, how can we tell the world specifically that the children in cages, separation of families, these huge detention camps, the raping of these girls, you know, the women having their hysterectomies removed, and boys too, the boys being raped, men being abused, is not an isolated incident, but it's part of a 27-year ongoing story and reality of genocide, of theft, murder, and rape. And we put a documentary together to show how the caging and abuse of children, on that alone, began in 1492 with Christopher Columbus, and it's still going on. So we want to show everybody, yes, you're Native American. When you get on the stage in front of millions of people from across the world, you're going to say, my name is so-and-so, and I'm Native American. And you can say from what such and such nation. In 5 seconds, you've told billions of people who your people are and where on the globe or the planet you come from. In 5 seconds, instead of trying to go through this whole, you know, we're the ones that, like, white people say they're white, black people say they're black. Us, we've been rewiring program. Everybody wants to get in on trying to be cool and creative and correct. And now we're in this competition to see who's right. And we're saying, look, we even say Native American is not the correct term, but it's a temporary strategy to put this beast down and re-empower our people. That's all it is. We're not talking about erasing who you are. Stop the colonial clowning around, and everybody's like, you know, everybody wants to be cool and correct. So it's like, it's that egocentrism that we've been reprogrammed with, individualistic behavior. It's not who we were. It's not who our ancestors are, where we think like I matter. No, we matter. Think about each other. you know?
Yeah, with the Institute for Chicana Psychology, we talk about that all the time, that we're collectivistic people. This individualism can be a real sickness, um so still though, I know that a large part of the people listening and grappling with who we are is trying to reconcile the cultural piece that we is dear to us, like me and my daughter have been making food from scratch: frijoles, arroz, tortillas de harina, and then reconnecting it with a metate to try and grind the corn and make that from scratch as well. So there's so many dear parts to who we are culturally. So it is going to be quite a thing to figure out how we identify culturally and as Native people. Go ahead, Kiawi.
You just, if I can add to what you just said, when you said tortillas and beans, those are not Latino foods or Hispanic foods. Those are Native American foods. Those are native,
Mm-hmm.
from throughout the Southwest all the way down into Central America. If those foods survived, it's because we survived. That means if those are Native American foods and we've been eating them all our lives, and your grandparents have been eating them, your parents, that's proof right there that we survived along with our foods. We're
In
Native
fact, most
American.
of those things that you're talking about that are dear, Kiawit and Tasutiani, to our people, and those familial things, and the things that we visually identify with, also our women wearing the huipiles and all that. A lot of those Mexican things, I mean, almost all of them are native. I didn't want to cut you off, hermano, but it's like, I'm just thinking down the line. I mean, all those things that are dear to us culturally are almost all come from our native ancestry, our native heritage.
So I want to ask all three of us, if it came down to it. I mean, we didn't get to talk about what terms we should use for when we're providing services. I guess we could use more terms, like we had the grant manual for providing COVID, mental health brief therapy, and we put Latinos for Latinos because we wanted people to know, if you're wherever you're from, if you're from Honduras or Mexico or wherever you come from, if you're Latino, then you can have these services. You can have this grant pay for your short-term brief therapy. So two last questions. I know we could go on probably for another 2 hours, but I maybe we can have a follow-up conversation that we can do again at another date. We can talk about that. But the two last questions would be, what term do you recommend we use for those of us that are trying to provide services and let people know what's available to them? And then the last term would be, what words would you use to identify who you are, um, racially, culturally, um, culturally, ethnically, or just, for you yourself personally, what would be your terms? So first question, first of the last two would be, Manuel, what word would you use to if you're going to offer services?
Well, I think part of what we've been talking about all the way through to some degree, and it's just the fact of our history that we're still dealing with, again, the conquest and the devastation of our identity. So we are left with sometimes going with strategies that are available to us. And so because this is not a discussion that, that I'll say a lot of our people are privileged to be able to have, because they're just working to make ends meet, and they're, moving forward. I think in terms of just getting outreach, we do use the term Latino or Latinx or Latina and Chicano. Um, and so even that for most of our people is it's a little fringy, Chicano. So, but that's my compromise, right now is, I won't go all the way to Hispanic, because I mean, it's all the same thing, but I just have too many years of an aversion, because that was one of my first lessons, was understanding, how problematic that was. And now I've seen the whole structure is problematic, but that was my longest. So I think just my reaction is, definitely don't use Hispanic. So I'll go with Latino, but I do want to include Chicano, because, you know, it's still a little fringy for our people, but that's my little like push. So, you know, Latino Chicanos, what I would use a lot of the times.
Let me see. Kiawit, if you were going to provide services like food distribution services or healthcare or mental health care, what terms would you use to let the people know that these services are for them specifically?
Well, we'd have to use the tools that we have at hand because we still don't have a foothold, like identity-wise. So definitely, yes, we'd have to use the terms that right now are negotiable for services, you know, and that's where we get our approach from a quote by Many Horses, where he said he had a vision that their descendants, all the Native people, would be running circles around the white people's shoes. We have it up on our page. I don't remember it specifically, but he said, you know, I am going to be as cunning as a coyote, you know, and I'm going to use their ways. You know, in other words, we're going to use the tools that we have at hand to advance where we want to get to, you know, for our freedom, you know. And if we have to, yes, we do refer to our own people as Latinos, or even in conversations, so that you know who you're referring to, you know, so that other people know, oh, okay, yeah, brown people, you know. But
To
you
help
know,
make that bridge.
but then after we help our people, we tell them, guess what, guys? Guess what, everyone? You're Native American, you know. But we have to use these terms now because, you know, people are making money off of it too.
Yeah.
You know, like a lot of these so-called benevolent organizations that are helping our people crossing the borders, the apartheid border, you know, they're making money because they're doing outreach and they're helping migrants, immigrants. So they're perpetuating the erasure of our people's indigenous roots. They're helping the system by calling them trespassers in a very friendly way, you know. And without that, if they were to change if they were to change the words, like these are migrants or Native Americans, they're not going to get funding. They're not going to get funding from whoever they get their money from, you know. They're like, man, you go there again. They touch, because this is gonna further open, pop the lid off of stolen land and murdered people, millions, mass genocide, and they do not want to go. So it's like, you know, put a band-aid on this and still put our arm around the, you know, the abuser is still putting, your handler is still putting your arm around you. We're helping you. I know we did it to you, but come on, we're helping you. You know, just go along with it.
You hear that a lot from progressive white people who are, you know, trying to, you know, like, we're here, we're trying to help, you know, sorry for what my ancestors did, but we're trying to help. But as we have this conversation now, we're down to the last question, because I know we've gone way over. We should probably have a follow-up conversation, plan it for another day. But as we have talked, we've seen how multifaceted, how complicated, you know, the oppression and the internalized oppression and the mechanisms, institutionalized mechanisms that have been used to confuse us as to who we are and separate us from our identities and from our power. So the last question, very simply, what will you choose to, what words will you use to identify yourself? Starting with Giawi.
I say Native American. And what else? What were the other words?
Just, it could be culturally, ethnically, just your own personal choice about what you would choose to identify yourself.
Oh, I just say I'm Native American from South Texas and from Central Mexico.
Okay, Manuel?
I think for me, which is also a whole way we could talk about this, for a lot of reasons, I've been going with Chicano indigenous, but I know indigenous as a whole other thing, because and a lot of the times I do, I have been doing this for years now on census and stuff, is labeling as Native American, because knowing the distinction between race and how important race is politically, that's always been something I've been cognizant of. ever since, I think all of us have had the discussion at some point when we were a lot younger about realizing that on our birth certificates, we're listed as white because that was the only race that was allowed at that time. And I know that I'm not white, so that's when the concept of race came to me. So anyway, my short answer is, Chicano, indigenous, and native in a lot of times when it counts officially, for things that, well, that I think make sense at the time.
Yeah,
Anyway,
for
yeah.
myself, I think, yeah, native when we're talking racially and culturally, I'm still trying to decolonize myself, but I'll still say Chicana. Um, and the medicine that I work with and practice is the Aztec Mexica medicine. And I'll continue to do that, and then also investigate further, if I can, about my own specific ancestry. But yeah, I would say still I would use Chicana and Native American, depending on what my focus is. Okay, well, did anybody have any last words? I think this has been a really good discussion to unpack things. I know it can be a little emotional, to discuss who we are. Did anybody have any final things they want to say, Kiawit or Manuel?
My battery's about to run out and I have
Okay.
10%. But before I go, I just want to flip the screen here and show you where we've been at. Here's a mural. I think it was his name is Raul Valdez, a famous Chicano Native American muralist here in Austin, Texas. And it shows the position we've been put in intentionally. And identifying as Native American can be a very effective avenue for the freedom of our people, because rather than protesting and knocking on their doors and begging the colonizers for permission and to stop calling us this and that,
Mm,
it's we who have to convince ourselves that we're Native American. That's our top job. And rather than protesting constantly, we have to infiltrate the system, get in on there, and take the levers, the control levers, and get in there and put our people in office to bring the beast down from within too. There's many ways to do it, but all in all, when we all unite and realize that we're Native American, when you look at the unification of our people as Native Americans from Patagonia to Alaska, we awaken the giant, and she will be unstoppable. When all our nations unite, our ancestral Native nations unite, she will be one powerful contender to bring the beast down. And we have to remember that our nations are women, are women. And that's why a lot of our people chose men to lead, because they were marrying the woman, the nation. So that's where our power lies, as the original Native American people of the Western Hemisphere. And there's no law that can tell you or compel you on how to identify. Thank you.
thank you for that. I'll show my background too. I've been here with the medicine, right? With my panwewe, my drum, the water, my poposhkomi, abuelo fuego, and the atecocolis under here, and all of the medicines from our madre. So, and Manuel, I know you have the first Chicano psychologist behind you. So we're walking with
Yeah.
our ancestors here as we have these conversations. Thank you, Kiawit, and thank you, Manuel. Did you want to say any final words, Manuel? Kiawit, if your battery dies, we just want to thank you for having this conversation with us. I know
Thank
what
you
it's
all.
like to, divide our time with our families and try and be present for our community. That's the way we all walk. But thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank you.
hermano. Thank you, Tlasatiani. I'm good. I just appreciate this conversation really, and I'm really glad we had it. And everyone who's watching, I think we're about close to like 5,000 people that we've reached. It looks
5,000?
like.
Wow.
So I think this is people are hungry for it, and hopefully we can connect again. Kiawi, thank you to your wife and your family too again, because we know what it's like to split our time from our family, and
Always.
again we're always doing that.
Our youngest is right here.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
okay,
you all.
thank you, everybody. Oh, Mateo.